Hey everybody, this is James, and I'm joined by
Garrett.
At TeaDB. So today we are not drinking tea, despite being right in front of my tea table here. We are going to be talking about something that Garrett and I talk about pretty frequently. Just because I think it hits a lot of the spots on just like our interest level. We're going to be talking about trajectories and regrets. Trajectories sort of like different ways, and I don't know where anyone is specifically in their tea journey, but I've been drinking tea for I think about 7 years now, and you for a couple of less years, 5 years?
Yeah, 4 or 5 years. Yeah.
Right, and so having a few more years under our belt, just talking about like sort of, the stereotypical, like what would you tell yourself right when you're getting started, different ways that you can sort of pursue I guess a Pu'erh collection / stash / whatever you want to call it. I tend to avoid trying to call it a collection because I'm in denial, but definitely is a common way to describe it.
Right.
So I think we're going to start off by talking about sort of like different trajectories. And I think there's a couple ways that you can sort of approach, and we are going to be focusing on Pu'erh here and teas that tend to age and tend to accumulate in your stash. One way you can do it, and I think this is probably the most simple and rational way, is just sort of buying as you go. Trying not to overaccumulate. The advantage of this is you don't need to concern yourself with buying too much or anything like that, or it's like you don't have to worry about aging, you don't have to worry about a lot of things.
Right. And like buying as you go also gives you enough space to kind of build your tastes, build your personal preferences, where you think you might start initially with one collection, or not collection, but like your overall stash might be slightly different like 2 years, 3 years down the road, just because you've had a chance to experience a whole wide variety of teas.
Right.
So it's always good to slow and steady kind of buy as you go initially.
And I mean, looking back, I would say that like I drank tea for probably a year and a half before I really started to accumulate tea in any sort of quantity. So like for me, this period was decently long, and I think it's probably wise that it be decently long, even if you eventually start to buy more than you can consume.
Right, and like for me it was just like an errant like 1 or 2 cakes here or there, and then it was like, hey, wait a second, there's this aspect of Pu'erh that I'm missing out on, this aging aspect, and then getting more into aging and the newer boutique teas and stuff like that.
Right.
As I went, of course, like things always were changing for me as I experienced more too. So yeah,
I mean, it's probably the least expensive way to approach the hobby. I know when you were first getting started, there's the possibility that you might move. You didn't want to have to move 50 kilos of Pu'erh because you don't have a mule.
Right. I have my mule with my bamboo lashes.
Yeah. Now you've got a full meal, so you can move wherever you want.
Yeah.
Rural Vermont, and just take your mule across the country.
Get there and hopefully still have a nice collection, a nice stash to work on.
And I guess before we move on to sort of buying more than you consume, you also had here as a point sort of understanding your personal relationship to price and value. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so when you're buying tea, I think it's important to understand where you're assigning value initially, especially early on in your experiences with tea that you can age, just because there's a lot of variety, there's a lot of different characteristics that you can focus on initially. You could focus on like a Western vendor that has a lot of new tea coming out every year, every season. You could focus on maybe more semi-aged tea, whether that's like a factory tea or maybe something boutique from earlier on. And I think it's important when you're looking, especially at price, to understand how you assign value to that price, whether or not it's something related to the scarcity of the tea or how you think that tea fits within the overall space of all the teas that you've seen so far. one thing early on that I kind of fell into in this kind of idea of assigning value was focusing too closely on single vendors and kind of comparing the teas within that vendor as I was shopping like online. Because I did that, I didn't have an opportunity to really explore the full gamut until much later in my tea journey. Because I was looking just at those specific teas and saying, well, this one is compared to this one on the same site is about the same thing, instead of this one compared to this semi-aged tea that's on like MX on a Chinese site is slightly.
So why don't we break that down slightly? So was it that you were looking too much, like let's say you're sampling teas from white tea?
Yeah.
Is it that you're comparing TX like Bosch on white tea versus like
Colbert on white tea as well?
Rather than you would have, in retrospect, been doing it more like white tea versus Yunnan sourcing, or white tea versus just like semi-aged tea that's like in a somewhat different type of tea?
So for me, it was comparing it to more of the experiences and stuff that I found initially, like on Taobao, and looking on those sites for a lot of the semi-aged stuff. So like looking at the semi-aged stuff that's available at your Western vendors, like your white teas and your Yunnan sourcings, and then comparing that to what's out there, more specific and closer to the Chinese market. And having those opportunities to.
So you wish you did that comparison more?
I wish I did. I think initially, it's really easy, and there's great access, and I think the Western vendors do a great job curating their stock. But looking at like a white tea versus a white tea, or like this, like all the Yunnan sourcing teas, and comparing it just to the Yunnan sourcing teas, I get stuck in that kind of bubble of assigning value based off of what I see in this current stock.
So it could sort of be, one way to think about it could be like you're comparing all these young teas versus each other, and you might identify the young tea that is the best value for you and for your palate. But it might turn out that this young tea, if you put it in like a greater context with semi-aged tea, for instance, for your palate, and we're not going to make judgments too harshly on young tea versus not. So it might be the case that just semi-aged tea, maybe it's only like average. And the better value in general is just like you could buy a lot of different semi-aged teas, and you would presumably enjoy those more.
Right. And then having the experience of buying teas that maybe I regretted more, it's just like that idea of when you buy something, what actually was I actually going in there to buy? Was it just like I was just needed from just like a very like plain Jane like psychological level, just needed something new, and I wanted to like attach that to my tea and my tea collection? I think it's very easy for somebody coming from like a Western lifestyle to fall into that trap with Pu'erh, because there's so much variety out there, and you can kind of shop around, and you can get into that mode where like I'm here just to buy things, and like this is a large aspect of the hobby, but I think there's also a whole lot of other gamuts that you could put your energy towards, and then also in the end probably save a little bit of money.
Right. And I think you shared a sort of a graphic with me. If I remember, I'll put that in the description below. Could you describe that real fast?
Yeah, so it's just a webcomic of a guy who is shopping online for an object. He finally gets his object, but doesn't feel any different when he has it after a while. So it's that idea of maybe what was the point of shopping.
So thinking about what you'll feel about the tea, which is of course a really difficult challenge. Thinking about what you'll feel about your purchase a month down the line when it's less of the shiny new object. Right,
exactly. And having that kind of time awareness.
Right. So moving along, so buying as you go, a perfectly fine way to approach this, in my opinion. And then you sort of get into buying more than you consume, whether it's intentional or not. Hopefully these things are at least somewhat intentional, as you don't want to fill up a room in your house unintentionally with Pu'erh. So at a certain point, hopefully it becomes unintentional. And for me, I highlighted two different ways, and you can have... I'd say that these ends are sort of like this end of the spectrum, this end of the spectrum. Of course, you can have sort of in between.
Right.
And the two methods I highlighted were sort of stamp collecting and hitting hard. And stamp collecting is basically where you do one cake, if depending on your definition, maybe two, of a lot of different teas. So it could be like buying one Colbert, one Bosch, one Yunnan sourcing, Jingyu tea, one this. So one of a lot of different things. And hitting hard is kind of the opposite. And I think hitting hard could depend a lot on who is the one hitting, what budget are you working with,
right.
how expensive is the tea, et cetera, et cetera. But it involves more targeting specific teas, and rather than buying one each of a lot of things, buying a lot of a certain tea. And I think Marshall, who had the influential post, Hitting Hard with a Hammer, I think for him, this amount would probably be at least a couple tongs, depending on the tea.
Right.
So at least that's the impression I get from his blog. I don't know for certain.
And I think Two Dog expanded on that too in his blog, right?
I think for someone like Two Dog, who is White Tea's proprietor, I think Hitting Hard might be even more than a couple tongs.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's budget depending. I think for
right.
some people, buying a tong is certainly hitting hard, and buying less than a tong might even be. So
right.
It depends. But the point is that the focus is less on, I want to collect these individual experiences of cakes, and more like, I want to have this tea around.
And that's not to say that you still can't sample. Like, I know a lot of my sampling experience, especially later on, there was no 10 grams, there's no 25 grams of all these weird semi-aged teas that I was buying from, like, Taiwan or mainland China. And so, like, I ended up having to collect a few of those just individual cakes just to get that sampling experience.
Right.
And
right.
I think that deviates, though, from the idea of sample collecting, because you have that on one hand, you're buying to sample with the idea that later on you're gonna like hit hard, hopefully on something that's good, that's great, that you're gonna be really comfortable about. And then the other hand, you have the person who buys the single cake and it's like, well, I just needed a 7542. Like,
right. Yeah.
That's
so,
it.
Yeah.
Like,
So
I got it.
In the case the first case you described, the cake is a sample,
right?
Whereas in the other one, it's sort of like the intent is a little different, and maybe it ends up looking the same, where you both end up with the same cake, but the intent behind it was different, and the overall philosophy of buying was also different.
Right. And for me, like, especially ways to keep myself under budget initially in the space, and keep myself pretty tight, was to, if there was a sample available, to always kind of favor that sample, or favor the opportunities to sample with other people more than just buying that cake as a sample. I know a lot of people really enjoy that. They really advocate for that whole cake experience. And I think that you'll definitely understand a tea once you've had 50 sessions with it. And I think you could, in my experience, I could understand a tea well enough with maybe just like 5 or 6 sessions instead of that like full gamut, full cake.
Right.
So with that said, though, is like, it's not saying like hitting hard is like the goal, it's the main forte. It's just something that I, in my tea journey, that I've been steadily trying to work towards, and because I know that I want to age. So it's like having that idea that, like, in the back of my head, like, hey, I want to find something that I can secure at least a few cakes of. And with that in mind, I need to get like as much variety as possible. So what's going to limit my ability to get that variety? Right.
And I think it's interesting that, and Garrett and I were talking before this about how we both sort of fall closer to the hitting hard camp, I think. But if you were to look at what the cakes you were accumulating up until very recently, when you got your first tong, you could probably interpret your buying and strategy. You would look a little bit closer to the stamp collecting, but I think that is for a variety of reasons. Yeah. But yeah, it's interesting and I think it sort of just highlights that the context does matter to to what you're buying.
Right, and like analyzing and being able to be a little more aware of where you want to go with your collection. If you don't know, being able to sample widely, I think is like one of the better tips that I can offer for folks trying to get into
Right.
the scene initially is to make sure that if you hear about a tea or you read about a tea, like for instance on TeaDB, and you're kind of curious about it, is looking for those opportunities to try that tea yourself, so that way you can compare it and kind of say, is this something that I want to focus on? Is this if this is an aged tea and it's from a certain area, and I know I've been buying this area maybe in like from a Western vendor or just wherever I'm getting that tea, is it something that I want to continue? And it's always having that awareness and ability to analyze where you're going. That for me was like part of the initial funness of getting into the hobby, like but also I think contributed to my collection overall. And
Right. Yeah. One thing that I have said to Garrett and to a few others on occasion is that like you can look at a cake as very as both a lot of tea and also not very much tea, depending on how you're looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
So on one hand, a cake, and if we're assuming it's a full 357 gram cake, that's 50 or 60 sessions of tea.
Right.
That's quite a bit. For people that only drink a couple times a day throughout the year, 50 or 60 sessions is an awful lot of tea.
Right.
But if we're to extend that sort of like time trajectory, and like hopefully if you are looking at sort of this long-term approach, you plan on drinking tea for a very long time. Drinking one cake over the course of 20 years, all of a sudden that's like 2 or 3 times a year. So
Right.
not a lot at all. And in that case, you sort of see how hitting hard could make a little more sense, because instead of having 50 or 60 sessions, if you bought 3 cakes or 4 cakes, you would have 150 to 200, or a full tong, you would have 350. And over the course of 20 years, you're going to be drinking a lot of tea. And personally, I think the case for hitting hard becomes like, in 20 years, if you just followed sort of that stamp collection route, you might have incredible variety, maybe hundreds of single bings. But but 20 years from now, you're going to just have a lot of partially consumed bings, which for me ends up sounding a little bit cluttered and messy. And you wouldn't know any of them super well. So when you're choosing something to drink, you're kind of sort of playing a lottery of sorts.
Right. If you've only drank this tea like twice a year for like 10 years,
Right.
And you have maybe like 10, 25 other like teas that you're doing the same thing with,
Right.
like how well are you going to notice if it's aging into something different? How well are you going to be like dialed into that? So it's definitely
Yeah. And it's sort of what is appealed to. There's nothing really inherently wrong with that approach either. It's just sort of what you like. And for me, I definitely gravitate more towards I would rather have 20 teas or 10 teas I know really well.
Right.
And I do think there are some good rationales for stamp collecting, such as like, okay, I am mainly following this one approach, but I do really want a reference cake for this. And it's quite expensive, so it doesn't make sense to buy more of it, or maybe you don't like the profile that much, so
Right.
I'm going to buy an 8653 from 2003 or something, because I don't think it's worthy to hit hard, but I do think it's valuable as a reference point to see sort of where my teas are going.
Yeah, especially if you have like a 2007 of that same blend, and then you have a nice kind of like, oh, hey, this might be where it's headed, or I should watch out for if it went this complete other direction, my like newer tea. I think that stamp collecting is good for having those points, and it's all a matter of kind of knowing yourself and knowing what you want out of your collection. Because I think what you want to avoid is like having a collection that you regret having, kind of like, or like you feel like, man, if I only did this one thing differently early on, I could have, would have gone and done this. It's just like helping you guys to like think about how where you want to go, and like where you want to go in the future, and just always trying to leave doors open instead of closing them shut.
Right. I would say one other advantage that stamp collecting does have over hitting hard is it does sort of spread out the risk a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think hitting hard could be a pretty bad idea if early on, because if you hit hard on the tee that you don't end up liking, the quantity is high, the monetary risk is higher. But when you do know that it's a tee that you're going to like, and you're pretty convinced that you're going to want to be drinking this for a long time, then I do think hitting hard does make a lot of sense.
Right, and it's like when you get to that point where you are convinced and you're like, I'm ready, let's do this, that I think hitting hard really shines as like an excellent way to have really great tea later on. Kind of within that idea of stamp collecting and hitting hard is avoiding situations where you feel like maybe you've overextended yourself with tea that maybe you don't necessarily anymore feel like you like. And I think that like thinking about like where I've gone with all the tea that I own and some of like the regrets that I have in regards to like my initial collection, and then like kind of the overall ideas about like what kind of fuels a person to make decisions that are necessarily not good for them later on. Like what is that? One aspect that like I feel like I had to like really come in touch with initially was the idea of that fear of missing out and like that FOMO.
Yeah.
And being able to look at that FOMO and I kind of like analyze it for myself and say, hey, where's this coming from? Is it something that like how true is it? Is it something that I could find this tea maybe again? Do I know if I could find this tea or
a similar tea?
Or a similar tea in the future? And I think that goes back to why I did a lot of what I did initially when I was just getting started, which was a lot of heavy sampling and a lot of Western vendors, because there was always these teas coming out every season from these certain areas. I really wanted to understand, like, hey, am I actually missing out here, or is it just kind of like this tea is like this, like one Jingo tea is like pretty much like that, like, or whatever,
or it's like 10% better, and in the Western scene, I'm just going to interject real fast. The most of the hype is really centered around young teas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. So, and because of the easy access there, and because of the like every year a new season comes out, kind of like a clothing collection, and there's always like a little bit more, I feel like, strategy towards marketing teas in a certain way, fancy wrappers, getting into like, hey, we only made 14 of these cakes, it's from this one branch on this great tree.
Playing into sort of the scarcity. You can see some of the parallels on like streetwear, supreme culture, or whatever. White tea, probably. Yeah,
I mean, you get into those kind of like branding aspects of the tea, and like even the scarcity aspect that's like part of the tea's like brand from like a cultural level. I would say like how much does that give you personal, like, ooh, I feel good, I'm like getting good value out of this, like how does that make you feel in like the long term, kind of going back to that image that's in the comments below, like once you get it, like, hey, it's another Pu'erh cake that you're gonna put in your stash, like being able to think about FOMO and think about and have an idea of like where the overarching space is in terms of Pu'erh and what's available to you, I think is important for kind of conquering that and being able to like move forward.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that kind of sort of segues in pretty well to our next one, which is the sort of like our largest regrets and things that we could have done differently. I can start us off here. I would say, thankfully, I did not hit hard on the wrong tee, as that would be kind of a painful thing. There are, of course, one or two cakes that if I were to do it again, I would maybe not buy them. So probably I overbought a little bit. I do think it's really easy to fall into sort of the category where you're like, oh, I'm not too sure, and you buy a little of this, a little of that. So I would have reduced that just a little bit. I mean, it's part of on one hand, it is part of the sort of like the tuition, the educational aspects that are necessary for a drinker. But maybe, but in retrospect, it leads to some accumulation that maybe isn't quite as desired 5 or 6 years down the line, as is my case.
Yeah.
And I would say, and I think this is probably a rare regret because I think I'm in somewhat of a unique situation as a YouTube person and someone that has a lot of samples. As I think I did oversample.
Yeah. And
it ended up having sort of the result where I just got super burnt out of young tea. I'm still kind of burnt out of young tea, even though it's been a few years. And I just have very little desire to drink it anymore. So I think I may have oversampled too many of the vendors and too many of the productions where at a certain point I had realized that, I was not as into the young tea as maybe other people are, or I would just rather bought some like semi-aged tea from anywhere.
Right. And I totally had a similar experience where like if there's like a larger regret that I had in my kind of overall growth in the space would be maybe sampling too hard initially on those Western vendors, because over time I felt like I was getting a lot of similar tea back to back, and I wasn't getting the dynamic experience that really made me get into Pu'erh in the first place.
Right.
And I think one of those things is like yeah, there's that individual cake way back when, like, oh, I could have got that like tea urchin from like 2014 before it got out or whatever.
Right.
And also, the other thing is like, I'm not sure if I had that cake right now, because it's been such a long time. Like, it's been like 3 or 4 years since a lot of these cakes that I wish I would have grabbed initially after they went out of stock. Back when they did go out of stock, my tastes have changed. So I'm not even entirely sure that if I had bought more Western tea initially...
Even the ones you like the most.
Yeah, even the ones I like the most. That I would be into them right now after drinking a lot of semi-aged tea and going to Taiwan a few times and being able to taste the like really dank stuff that I really enjoy over there.
Yeah.
And
actually compares pretty well value-wise to what you might get in the West.
Right.
Yeah, and just to clarify the context just a little bit, Garrett and I did a lot of sampling. I think probably myself a little bit more so even than you.
Yes.
From like, it would have been like 20 samples from Yunnan Sourcing, 15 samples from Cha Long Shop, 15 samples from Tea Urchin, 15 samples from White Tea, more samples from Pu'erh SK, more from Essence of Tea, more from Bitter Leaf Tea. I literally think we hit all of those, and there's probably some I'm forgetting too. So just drinking that amount of tea, which is probably literally over 100 young teas over the course of not a long time, can really get you a little burnt out. And thankfully, my stomach has stayed intact.
Yes.
But it did convince me that young teas are not the tea for me to be buying and to be drinking regularly.
Right. And I think that is important because you have that understanding now because you had the opportunity to sample so widely.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of value in sampling, especially wherever you can find it initially. Like if it is at a Western vendor and you're just experiencing different leaf grades, or if you're trying to experience more semi-aged tea, maybe you're sampling something from like Taobao or something like that. I think early on, at least in my own journey, if I were to do things again and like with the idea that like, I can't just like psychically link with my past self.
Yeah.
I would advocate for more variety of sampling and being able to experience the wider gamut.
Right.
And a lot of it's just as you learn, right? Like you've like posted a lot of videos on like YQH and like but like a year or two before like YQH was really big, it was like really difficult to find. It was like this errant tea that maybe you saw at like Hoda or something like back in 2007.
Not too common until Emmett sort of brought it to the West.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And I'll also add real quickly that variety of sampling doesn't mean sampling for more vendors. It means sampling different genres. It's like, and you have to be very intentional about it, I think, to sample things. While you can find semi-aged tea from a lot of these vendors, Yunnan sourcing in particular, you do have to really seek it out, because something like 85 to 90% of the teas that are added, the Pu'erhs are young. So that's where the hype is. That's where the majority of teas. If you just pointed at a dartboard and just picked teas, you would still end up sampling what's predominantly young Sheng Pu'erh from most vendors. So you really do have to seek out those different experiences.
Right. And that requires, I think, a lot of intention, a lot of effort initially, but overall, that's also what provided me with most consistent and most like experiences that I'm happy with when it comes to buying and acquiring tea. And like, if I was gonna like wish it on anybody, that's probably what I want, is like get that variety, get those samples in, get those reps, yo.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing it did is provided us a lot of reps, and like I don't need any further convincing that young tea is not for me.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Any final thoughts?
Let's see here. Sample initially. I think we pretty much got it.
Okay. Thank you all for tuning in. Let us know how you like this video. Appreciate any feedback for some of these special episodes. If you want to nerd out on Pu'erh spreadsheets and stuff like that, I think this is a perfect episode for you. And we'll see you all next time. Cheers.